Your Life Church Livonia.
My name's Brian. I'm the pastor here. And I left my notes for my sermon on the back table, so I'm just going to wing it. Sound good? I'm just going to go. Actually, Alex is going to bring them to me. And so we are in the midst of a series. It's called Immerse. And this particular section is called Kingdoms. And what we've been doing is we've been reading through God's Word and investigating what does it look like for us to actually read it for ourselves and not just depend on other people. And so I brought my favorite Bible today. This isn't the Immerse book itself, but it's my favorite book that I can read and study God's Word. And in this particular version, 1,400 pages. 1,400 pages in this Bible. And sometimes really thin pages. Am I the only one who struggles to turn the pages of the Bible sometimes? And you get like 10 pages at once, and you just keep skipping over the same book over and over again. Makes me want to go crazy. But imagine if the pages weren't thin. They'd be like the old-time Bibles that were this thick, and you needed a special stand for them. And so Genesis to Revelation, an amazing, epic tale of God's pursuit of you. An unbelievable story of the way that God is pursuing that which he created. Never letting go, always seeking us out with his love. And the chunk of the 1,400 pages in here, the chunk that we've been reading as a church, and it's not too late to jump in and do this with us, is a smaller chunk. It's really about 200 pages, a little less than 200 pages in my Bible, broken up over 8 weeks. It's very doable. And it's the story from Joshua through 2 Kings. And what we're committed to is weekly then exploring that portion of text that we all read together on a Sunday morning. And today, what I'm supposed to do is I'm supposed to talk about 1 Samuel. I was supposed to make a transition from the time of the judges when God repeatedly had to send someone to rescue Israel from their messed up ways, from the ways that they would depart from the path that God had placed them on. God would have to send these judges to save them over and over again. And things would go pretty good for a portion of time, especially as long as the judge was alive. And then the judge would pass away and things would all get all messed up again. And I was supposed to transition from that time to the moment when God finally relents and gives them the king that they've always been asking for but didn't need. That's what I was supposed to do today. But in order to do that, I would have to jump from the book of Judges straight to the book of 1 Samuel. And in so doing, it would be like that moment when you turn the page of your Bible and you accidentally turn 5 or 6 pages. Well, in this case, when you get to the end of the book of Judges, if you skipped 4 or 5 pages, you would skip an entire book of the Bible. You would miss out on one of the most incredible short stories that exists in the Bible. In my particular copy of it, it's 4.5 pages. 4.5 pages. 0.3%. I did the math. 0.003% of the Bible is found in this one little story about a woman named Ruth. We can't skip it. We can't skip this story. And honestly, it'd be easy to miss it because you're flipping your pages and you just go by. It'd be easy to skip it, especially in the context of evangelical Christianity when the stories of women often get passed over. But it's too important for us to skip it, and it's worth more than just a footnote in our story. So 1 Samuel is going to have to wait. Because today we need to talk about Ruth. Her story is amazing. I love it. Why do we need Ruth? We need the story of Ruth because it shows us the way that God can weave beautiful things into our stories, even when our stories are incredibly dark and difficult. The story of Ruth, it shows us how our amazing God will draw people into his family and then use them in that family to do incredible things. The story of Ruth paints a picture of hope in the midst of despair, It shows us how to persevere when nothing seems to be going right at all and life seems to be falling apart around us. And ultimately, it shows us how to discover that our God is faithful to us even when we've been unfaithful to him. Ruth is a redemption story. Ruth, the story of Ruth, is the story of God's pursuit of all humanity. We talk a lot about the gospel, the good news of Jesus. We talk a lot about the way that that good news can transform people. In the story of Ruth, we see it come to life. We're not skipping it. So we're going back. And it's especially refreshing because the time of the Judges is filled with stories of men who only followed God when it was convenient. They only followed God when it worked out in their agenda, in their schedule, in their current set of needs. And then you come onto this little story that happens during that exact time frame. The story of Ruth happens during the time of the Judges. Remember the book of Judges, when we talked about it last week, they would have a difficult time making it rated R if they made it a movie. It would probably be more like NC-17. It's brutal. But then comes Ruth. Absolutely amazing. But her story doesn't start out in an amazing space. So I want to read to you from Ruth chapter 1, the very first verse, the very first chapter, says this. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. So I want to just pause there for a moment and acknowledge that the decision to leave home for Elimelech to leave home would have been a very difficult decision. People just didn't do this. It wasn't like today when you get dissatisfied with your job, you just quit your job and move on. And we have people that are moving all around the country and they grew up in this town, but they now live in this state and they lived in that state for 7 years and now they live in this one. People just didn't move around. And so to move not only to a new town, but to a new country would have been a massive deal. Things would have had to have been really bad in their hometown of Bethlehem for them to want to go. But why were things bad? Things were not going well in Bethlehem because of what was happening in the spiritual life of the nation of Israel. It's super interesting to me that they had to leave the town of Bethlehem, which, do you know what the word Bethlehem means? House of bread. They had to leave the house of bread because it had no bread. I'm not going to lie, if my house had no bread, I might want to leave too. I love me some bread. It was called the house of bread because their crops were always plentiful. They were known especially for their barley harvests. And they left. It wouldn't have been an easy decision to leave. And the judges, it tells us that the judges ruled during this time. And the judges had repeatedly told the people of Israel that if they would repent from their wicked ways, if they would stop following after these pagan idols, that God would show up and he would save them. He would say, the judges would say the key to the end of this famine, the key to the end of this drought, the key to the end of these sufferings that you're experiencing right now is to return to me. And so in this moment, what we understand from Scripture is that the key to escaping the famine wasn't an escape to Moab, it was a journey back to God. But Elimelech didn't get this. He thought that the key to escaping the famine was to escape Israel, to escape Bethlehem, to escape his family of origin, his place of origin, and go into a new land. But the problem is that Elimelech headed in the wrong direction. He went the direction of Moab, where at that time they were worshiping these pagan idols. They were doing all these honestly awful things where even human sacrifice was being practiced in the country of Moab. Moab is a country that at one point had enslaved the people of Israel for 18 years. And he decides, I think it's a good idea if we immigrate to Moab because there's a famine here. God's judgment is upon us here, so I know what will make it better. I'm going to move my family to a godless place. It could be real easy for me to look at Elimelech and think, man, what in the world was happening with his decision? I don't know his thoughts. I don't know his mind, but I see the results of it. And I know that this type of decision doesn't reflect the kind of commitment that God was asking of his people. It doesn't reflect the kind of commitment that God was calling the Israelites into. And so the story feels like same song, second verse, same as the rest when it comes to the book of Judges, right? It doesn't start off well. But then they get to Moab and the story takes a hard left turn. Ruth chapter 1, verse 3. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her two sons. The two sons married Moabite women, which, by the way, God had told them not to do. Very specifically, do not make a treaty with the Moabs. Do not marry them, because their practices were so foul and so vile that God knew that if they began to intermarry, that it would ruin them. So they moved there. Elimelech dies. Naomi's left with her two sons. The two sons married Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, and the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her two sons or her husband. It doesn't get much worse than this. If the book of Ruth were to be made into a movie, and that movie were to have a soundtrack, I'm picturing the opening scene of this movie. The three women are standing in a cemetery and it's raining. It's always raining in those scenes, right? Bagpipe music is playing, right? They didn't have bagpipes then, but that's what I'm picturing in my brain. It's this unbelievably difficult moment as they mourn the loss of all of their husbands. Elimelech, Mahlon, Chilion. And now it's just Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. And especially knowing that Orpah and Ruth had come out of Moab, out of this godless place. You could look at this story and think there is no way that there is going to be anything beautiful that comes out of this. No way that a redemptive, God-sized story could come out of this. And if you thought that, you would be wrong. That even though Naomi was literally in one of the worst places you could possibly be, far from home, seemingly far from hope, God can still work in those spaces. And as they mourn, as they grieve, as they wonder what's next for their life, Naomi gets word that God has visited Bethlehem, her hometown. That something happened. A judge showed up, that the people repented, that they turned back to God. And because they turned back to God, now Bethlehem is beginning to thrive again. The famine has been broken. The drought has been broken. The crops are about to be harvested. She hears all of this good news when she's away from home in a place called Moab, and she makes a decision, I'm going home. So she goes to the other two women and she says to them, I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. I think you should go back to your families of origin and make a new life there, find new husbands there. It's not too late for you. It's too late for me. I'm an old woman. I'll never find another man. I'll never have more children, but it's not too late for you. You should start over, go home. And they both resisted. It's really interesting. Both Orpah and Naomi resisted. There was something about Naomi's faith that was intriguing to them. Even in the midst of hardship, there was something about Naomi's belief in who God was that was intriguing to them. Orpah didn't want to go. Ruth didn't want to go. And they're walking down the road. They're already journeying back towards Bethlehem, headed in the right direction. And they have another discussion on the side of the road. And ultimately, Orpah says, okay, I'll go home. And she turns and she walks back towards Moab. But in that moment, on the side of the road, Ruth resists. And I love this conversation. I want you to picture them standing on the side of a dirty, dusty road, carrying their few meager possessions on the way back to a place that Ruth had never even visited. And they have this conversation. Naomi says, go home, go back to your people. And in verse 16 it says, but Ruth replied, don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us. First of all, Ruth's intense, right? Like, imagine if you were walking along the side of the road and overheard this conversation. You'd be like, that girl is intense. Like, she's in it all the way. And this moment, it wasn't just about Ruth following Naomi. This moment was about Ruth making a decision to follow God. This was her conversion moment. This was that moment where she'd been seen. Naomi at times gets a bad rap in the story because she's hurting and broken. But there was something to her faith that was so intriguing to Ruth, something that drew her into this moment where Ruth says, I'm going to follow your God. She was renouncing what it meant to be a Moabite. Renouncing what it meant to be from that family of origin and saying, from this moment on, I am one of God's women and I am part of your family. You are my mother. It was an all-in decision for Ruth. She went all in, held nothing back. Her conversion in that moment was a complete trade-in of her whole identity. I want you to imagine, you go to the car dealership and you say, I want something brand new. You give them the old car, they give you a new one. You drive away, you never look back at that piece of junk that you left there, right? This was what Ruth did. She traded in her whole life. A complete trade-in for a completely new identity. And it wasn't just a new last name. It was a transformational experience for her internally that she became a new person. She now is following after God. Ruth, the Moabite, the penniless widow with no children and no hope, who grew up surrounded by a culture that practiced human sacrifice and now was giving her whole life to God. If we go back to the movie scene, it used to be bagpipes and rain, and now it's sunshine, and the music has changed, right? It begins to be hopeful. It begins to be beautiful. And in this moment, as the song shifts, the story shifts, and you can feel it. Something new is coming. And a lazy, if I was writing this story, a lazy author would end the story here because it's such a beautiful moment. But Ruth's story was literally just beginning. Her conversion moment here is inspiring to me. And my hope is that it would be inspiring to you as well. Her conversion, her transformation, and decision to follow Jesus is inspiring to me because she's modeling exactly what it is that God was calling the Israelites to do for all those generations. What she chose to do was what the judges were asking the Israelites to do over and over again. They were saying, come and follow God, commit yourself, be all in. Be fully committed. God had told them over and over again, he said, trust me completely. Like all the way, trust me completely. He would say to them, follow me even when life gets hard, because it will get hard. He would say to them, depend on me when for strength when you feel weak. He would say, let me be your strength when you are weak. I'll do it for you. He would say, lean on me when you don't know what to do, when you lack wisdom, when you lack insight into what's next, what your next steps are. Jesus says to us, and God would say to them, he would say, lean on me, trust me, depend me, follow me, and I will show you the way. I want to be your everything. Ruth's conversion in that moment when she went all in was everything that God was asking the Israelites to do for all those years. He would say, commit yourself fully to me because I'm fully committed to you. God was all in for the Israelites. And now Ruth was all in for God. God's all in for you. And the question that we have to wrestle with, are we all in for God? Ruth made a declaration that day on the side of the road. A declaration that her commitment to God and her commitment to Naomi wouldn't be conditional. It wasn't conditional at all. And my prayer is that we would learn from her choice. Because this is what I know, that a conditional surrender to God doesn't lead to a fruitful relationship with God. Think about that. A conditional surrender to God doesn't lead to a fruitful relationship with God. It's not just with God, it's with anyone. What if you decided that you were going to get married and you made that, and you said, honey, I really want to get married to you. I love you, but I have some conditions. I'll love you as long as. That feels a little weird, doesn't it? As long as, I'll be committed to you as long as you don't make me frustrated. I'll be committed to you as long as life goes well, as long as we both have our jobs and we're not struggling financially, as long as our kids turn out the way that I envisioned that they would when I was a kid, as long as we don't have any major crises, as long as there's no major bumps in the road. I'll be committed to you as long as. This is a conditional marriage. And guess what happens to conditional marriages? They end. They don't last. They're not fruitful. The same thing is true in our relationship with God. I know that a conditional surrender to God doesn't lead to a fruitful relationship with God. It was true for the Israelites and it's true for us. The famine that was happening in Bethlehem that caused Elimelech to leave in the first place wasn't just a physical reality for them. It was a spiritual reality for them. It wasn't just a physical famine, it was a spiritual famine because their relationships with God weren't fruitful, because their surrender to God wasn't complete. It was incomplete and it was conditional. And what I want you to know is that our spiritual famines, when you feel like you're in a place of spiritual famine, of spiritual drought, that sometimes it's a symptom of conditional surrender, incomplete surrender. When it feels like it has stopped raining in your life and there's drought, when the crops stop growing and the relationships wither up, one of the first things that you should do is ask yourself the question, where am I at in relationship to God? Where am I at? Maybe you're a Moabite who grew up in a context where God wasn't even a part of the conversation, and you've never had an opportunity to even have a relationship or to be exposed to someone who had a relationship with the one true God. And now you've been given this opportunity. You're here at church. You're surrounded by people that have met God, and you have an opportunity, just like Ruth had, where now she's met Naomi, and there's something about Naomi's relationship with God that calls to her, that is inviting to her. And you're in this moment where you're looking around, and the crops are dying, and the relationships are withering, and it feels like the rain has stopped a long time ago in your life, and you're wondering, could there be something different? And the answer is yeah, absolutely. Ruth's life was transformed by her decision that day, and your life can be transformed as well. Ruth traded in her entire old way of living, and instead was given something brand new, and that same thing can happen for you. Maybe you're a Moabite, and God wants to change your story. I believe that today could be your side of the road experience. Or maybe you're already one of God's people. You're struggling with drought, struggling with famine, and you're beginning to realize that it's caused in part by a partial or a conditional surrender to God. The key to escaping the famine wasn't an escape from Moab. It was a journey back to God. And that same thing that was true for Elimelech is true for us. Which way are you headed? It's really easy to give up. It's really easy to either head the wrong direction or just to camp out on the side of the road and be miserable. And the invitation that this story gives to all of us is to head towards God. To make a decision there in that moment to say, no, listen, I am all in. I am all in. I want God to be the one who authors my story. I want to trade in the old way of doing life, and I want to do something brand new. And if we read the rest of Ruth's story, if we follow the rest of this incredible short story, 4.5 pages, we see incredible things. And if you know the full story, you know that it ends in a beautiful spot. You know what God did with her complete, total surrender. But if you don't know the story, I want to help you to understand what happened. They made it back to Bethlehem. They were welcomed with open arms. Naomi is still struggling, and so she gets home, and they're like, could this be Naomi? And she's like, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitter. She was still hurting. But Ruth is steadfast. She's like, I'm in it all the way. People are like, who is this woman with you? And, oh, this is my son's widow. Her name is Ruth. And Naomi and Ruth, they don't know what to do. And so they could have been paralyzed in that moment. They could have just holed up in whatever kind of lodging they could find and been dependent upon other people to help them out. But Ruth says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do something. And so she looks for a field. They get there. When they get to Bethlehem and they're in the midst of the barley harvest, this amazing, bountiful harvest. The famine is broken. The drought is ended. And so Ruth says, I'm going to go find a field that I can glean in. When you glean in a field, what you did is you would follow behind the workers as they harvested the crop, and anything they dropped, you would pick up. It was a common practice. It was something God had commanded, that he would say, hey, allow the people amongst you who are poor to glean in your fields so that everyone can eat. And she's gleaning in a field, and some of the fields weren't even safe to be in because some of them were owned by people that weren't good. But it just so happens that Ruth ends up in the safest field she could possibly have been in. It just so happens that the field she ends up in was owned by a man named Boaz, who was a godly man. It just so happened that Boaz was a relative of her deceased husband. It just so happened that not only was he a relative of her deceased husband, he was also what was known then as a kinsman redeemer. I could spend all day talking about kinsman redeemers, but let me just tell you really simply what that means. It meant that he had a responsibility to care for Naomi and Ruth if anything happened to their husbands. It just so happened that Ruth ended up in his field. She comes back that day with her arms full of food. And Naomi says, where have you been, Ruth? And Ruth says, well, I ended up in the field of this amazing man named Boaz. He was really kind to me, helped me, gave me more than I deserved. And Naomi says, excuse me, whose field were you in? How in the world did you end up in Boaz's field? God must be doing something. She goes on to tell her who Boaz was. As the story goes on, she goes back and there's more interactions, and Boaz makes the decision that he's going to live into what God called him to do, to be the kinsman redeemer. He ends up taking Ruth as his wife, and they get married. And Naomi gets enfolded into their family. And incredible things came from that moment. God was at work in their story, even while they were wrestling and struggling, penniless in Moab. Boaz and Ruth have a child. They name him Obed. Obed goes on to have a family, and he became the father of a man named Jesse. Jesse has a family and ends up with 8 sons. And his youngest son was named David. David slew Goliath. David became king. David was a man that has been referred to as a man after God's own heart because David was committed to God in the same way that his great-grandmother Ruth was. A former pagan Moabitess, completely all in, transformed by God, and folded into God's family because of someone redeeming her story, and now God using her to produce the greatest king that Israel had ever known out of her line. And if you go back in the story even further and you look at the story of Boaz, you realize that one of his relatives was a woman named Rahab. Do you know who Rahab was? She was a prostitute who had met the invading Israelite army when they first came into the promised land and had helped them and had given her life to God and been transformed by God and folded into the family, married into the Israelites. And one of her descendants was Boaz. Boaz then enfolds Naomi and Ruth into his family, who were outsiders. And now David comes from this line. God was working in their story way before they ever knew that God was working in their story. And it all stems back to people making a decision to be all in with no conditions. All in with no conditions. And as you hear this story, you might be tempted to think, well, my life is nothing like Ruth's. There's absolutely no way that God could do something that amazing with my life. And here's the truth, friends, is that's just not true. That God is working in your story right now. Whether you're on the side of the road, dusty and tired, whether you're living in a far-off land where you shouldn't be living, whether you're on a journey away from God or a journey towards God, God is still at work in your story, ready to write a new one, waiting for you to make the commitment to doing it his way. How will you know what that story will be unless you try? How will you know what that story will look like until you jump in? Ruth made an unconditional commitment to God before she had ever seen Bethlehem, before she had ever heard about Boaz, before she ever knew what the story was going to look like, because she believed God. She made a leap of faith, and God did incredible things with her story. Earlier, we ended with David as the primary key legacy of her commitment to God. We ended with the story of David as like the capstone of her spiritual and biological legacy. But the reality of this story is that David was not even close to the most significant thing that came out of Ruth and Boaz's life. If you remember earlier, we said that they lived in Bethlehem. Who else do we know that was born in Bethlehem? Jesus. Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? That wasn't where they were living at the time. Why was he born in Bethlehem? There was a census that required everyone to go back to their place of origin, to go back to the town where their people were from. They went back to Bethlehem because the family of Jesus was in the house and the line of David, who was in the house and the line of Boaz and Ruth. The greatest legacy that Ruth has in her family legacy is Jesus, born into her family. God at work redeeming the whole world. God at work redeeming Ruth. God at work redeeming you and I through Jesus. This is the story of the gospel. So having David as her great-great-grandson was really cool, but having Jesus in your family? And here's the beautiful thing, is that we have an opportunity today to have an on-the-side-of-the-road moment. Because we could all have Jesus in our family. Because he wants us in his. Today we had the Davises stand up here in front of us, and we said, we commit to walking alongside of your family because you're in ours. Today we had this beautiful picture of what it looked like to have a blended family. There was a family by choice, right, that stood up in front of us. We can become family by choice in God's family if we make a decision on the side of the road. This is your moment. This is your moment to ask yourself the question, where am I at with regards to God? Am I far? Living in drought, living in famine? Wondering if God could ever tell a story about me? The answer is yes. Are you partway in? Where you put your foot in the pool but you don't jump in? Are you ready to go all in? Complete, total surrender. Here I am, God. Knowing that I will get disappointed. Knowing that I will be hurt. Knowing that it won't always go perfect, but knowing that in the midst of it all, you will be telling a story that's bigger than me. A story that may find its fulfillment during my lifetime, but may take generations to tell completely. The decisions you make today don't just affect you, they affect your spouse or your future spouse, your children or your future children, and their children, and their children, and their children, and on. Complete and total surrender to God is the path towards a transformed life, and I want to invite you to that today. Would you pray with me? Jesus, this story of the redemption of Ruth is so inspiring to me. And I think in part, God, it's inspiring to me because I feel like Ruth's story is my story, and Ruth's story could be all of our stories of what it looks like to be drawn into your family. The invitation is always there, God. You are always the same, always ready, always willing, ready to hand out your love and your grace, ready to hand out new lives and new names, ready to hand out transformation and forgiveness and redemption, God. You're ready to give those things, waiting for us to receive it. And the pathway to receiving that, God, is the same as it was thousands of years ago. It's complete and total surrender to you. So here in this moment, God, we make that decision. Here in this moment, we say, God, I'm all in for you. I want you to invite you, even as we continue praying, to do something bold. I don't do this often, but Lord, I just sense this moment where we're on the side of the road. I want to invite you, if you're in a space where you're saying, I want to be all in for Jesus. I want to be all in for a traded in life. I just invite you to stand. All in for God. Jesus, look upon your people, coming to you ready, all in, ready to have a new story written about their life, ready to be filled with your power and your presence, ready to have stories told about you because of their life, ready to be transformed into something that they never could have imagined that they could be. God, look at your people who are standing on the side of the road today, who are saying they're all in. Start a new story today, God. We trust you. We love you. We commit ourselves to you. Totally all in. And we pray these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.